and welcome to another Teach Tuesday video. This is our next video in a series on buzzwords. Today's buzzword is gamification. Gamification is the use of game design elements in other areas, in our case education, in order to increase engagement. So how do game design elements increase engagement? Well, we could think of them in terms of motivation to do an action, which gives us a reward, which builds into an achievement, which, of course, motivates us to carry out further actions. In terms of game design, this comes down to an overall objective, or goal, or win state. The paths you take to reach that objective come down to mechanisms, some people call them mechanics, and dynamics, which together describe the way that players interact with the materials of the game, the goal, and each other. These are built up of the rules, which dictate the way the mechanisms are supposed to function, components, and skills, or in our case, prior knowledge. So you'll notice that we're being motivated to carry out an action, and in doing so, depending on what our skills already are, we might experience a challenge. And so the balance of challenge is very important. And so in game design, we talk about what's called flow, which is the balance of skills or abilities and the challenge itself. So as you can imagine, as I grow in skill, the challenge I'm facing has to increase. If I get too skilled to offset the challenge I'm being given, I can get bored. But if I'm being too far challenged that offsets my skill, it gives me anxiety. And so what flow describes is sort of the sweet spot, or the Goldilocks zone, where as your skills increase, the feedback increases the challenge. So what does this mean in terms of course design or gamification? Well, there's some takeaways to consider. And as Bryan Carr, who gamified one of his courses, you're going to hear from him now, is sharing his experience, I want you to think about a few key things. One is that clear goals are important. Goals are at the top of the game design pyramid. They're also at the top of the course design pyramid. So making sure the goals are clear to the students or are transparent is key. You also need to understand the motivation for gamifying and for what the students are supposed to do. These are the mechanisms and dynamics. So you need to be intentional. With gamification, you're encouraged to keep it simple or start small. You want to encourage failure, not in the sense of the course, but in the sense of tasks. And in encouraging failure, you need to have continuous feedback. Contributing to a growth mindset. And the more instantaneous that feedback can be, the better. And of course, sort of the final thing to think about, you should do this in all your courses, but especially in gamified ones, you need to test, test, test. And I don't mean test in terms of exams, I mean test in terms of this is my goal or my objective. Did we meet that goal by doing this? In terms of game design, this would be play testing, but in terms of course design, getting feedback from your students to make sure that they're getting out of the course what you expect them to. And so this we might think of as assessment of the activity. So now you're going to hear from Bryan Carr, who carried out a gamification of one of his courses. If you're interested more in gamification, we'll have resources in the email that comes out with this video, or you can always feel free to reach out to myself or any of my colleagues in the Center for the Advancement of Teaching and Learning.
My name is Dr. Bryan Carr. I'm an associate professor in communication and information science, and I did a study on gamification in the classroom and whether or not it can be used to actually get students to do the reading that's assigned. So gamification is really the idea, if you want to get kind of down to the sort of root essence of it, is the idea that we're applying game design principles to real world things. In this case, learning. I mean, it's used in the business world and that kind of thing as a reward or incentive structure. But for education, it's how do we actually get students to engage with course material, complete assignments, etc., while eschewing kind of a traditional sort of do the assignment, get the grade system, and moving toward one that is more about empowering students to actually look upon this as an activity that is at least enjoyable or competitive or something like that, to essentially increase their engagement and excitement about the projects. And so that's really what education's trying to do, right? So we start off with the most fundamental and basic ideas. We start with those ideas that are the most important and kind of basic and elemental to our learning, and then we build on them. So if you know how to write an essay, now could we maybe have you do something where you take your thoughts and ideas and then you build upon them to do a critical version of that essay, or change that essay in terms of format to making a video, or do something where you take those basic ideas you introduced in the essay and write more of a monograph or a longer form paper with them, right? So there's a lot of parallels between these particular forms of education design. And so I think that there's really a lot to be learned from gamification, or at least game design, in the educational process and in the development of pedagogy. So my model was relatively rudimentary. There are a lot more complex gamification systems out there. Mine I kept fairly simple for the sake of the fact that I was trying to do one particular thing. I wasn't doing a radical overhaul of the course. My question was just, can I get students to read the things I wanted them to read? And the challenge in my class is that in the class that I did this, it's not a textbook-based course. Because the subject matter and the material changes so rapidly over time, it didn't make sense to have a book assigned. So what I did instead is I would assign newspaper articles, journal articles, videos, websites, that kind of thing. And the hope was to be like, okay, well, students don't have to pay for this, which is great, but it's also a lot more content. It's not super regimented. How do I actually make sure they're reading it and taking away the things they need to take away from it? So that's where the gamification element came in. So what I did is I followed kind of the basic gamification structure, and that's the XP model. So if you're familiar with games, a lot of times, whether it's D&D or Fallout or whatever, you'll do an action, it gives you experience points, and then you trade those experience points in to level up, quote unquote, where you get additional perks, statistical bonuses, etc. So mine was more like, okay, if you have done the reading, I'm going to give you these small little tasks. They're going to be, for example, structure an argument based on this article. Give me the claim, the data, the warrant, or match up the Supreme Court cases with what they decided. So essentially things you had to have read or be familiar with the material before you're actually able to do them, but not something that really rose to the level of being a full-on assignment or paper or something like that. So for every assignment based on the level of intensity or challenge, I would give a certain amount of XP. So once you hit like 1,000 XP from doing these assignments, you get 5 extra credit points in the class. Another level might get you another 5. Another level might get you a free answer on the exam, that kind of thing. So it's a fairly rudimentary structure. And I also made it optional for the students, because that was one of the things in sort of going through and getting it approved, that I had to make it so students didn't want to participate, they could still get extra credit another way, or they didn't necessarily have to participate if they didn't feel comfortable. So it was optional and fairly simple and really, really focused on the specific question of student reading. The outcome was somewhat mixed. And I think it's not necessarily to speak negatively about gamification as a concept. I think the issue is more, it's something you have to go all in on. right? So if you look at, you look at a lot of the texts and works on gamification in the classroom, they are talking about a total renovation, a complete overhaul of the course built around these game structures, about teams and XP and that kind of thing. I just took the one part of the class and made it optional. Had I maybe done it and made it less optional, I might have gotten a bit of a better feedback. Certainly I would have gotten more response on the surveys and that kind of thing I used to evaluate it. But the thing I did notice, and the thing that gave me hope, is number one, exam scores did go up. I also did notice, based on the survey responses, that students generally liked the assignments when they did them. They found them useful, they found them helpful in kind of getting more out of their reading. But the one recurring thing was, this is additional work on top of the other work we're doing, right? You really do have to kind of get student buy-in early on, and the best way to do that is to really design the course from the ground up to be gamified. So if I were doing it again, I might look, instead of saying, hey, I'm going to have a standard, do these essays, do these exams, that kind of thing, where you have to do these assignments. I might give them more freedom and say, all right, so we're going to have a couple things that you've got to do, like the exams, the final paper, but those are only this part of your grade. How you get to the A is up to you, right? If you want to get up to that grade, you might also design it where students are like, boy, I'm really kind of struggling in these other parts. Maybe I can invest my time elsewhere where I'm really, really strong, where I'm doing things like, writing short essays or doing these multimedia projects or something like that, where these are my strengths, these are my areas, and I'm actually engaging with the material in a different way. We could sort of set you aside into teams, and each team member has a role, and so you're all trying to kind of work together, keep each other honest, and collaborate, trying to make sure that your team wins at the end of the semester. There's all kinds of different ways you can approach it. The way I try to do it is, I want you as a student to actually pursue these things. I'm giving you an incentive to do so, because a lot of gamification is built around that incentivization, right? I'm giving you some kind of reason to actually do this thing. Having that sort of thing where it's like, hey, I was going to read anyway, or I might make some time for reading because I know there's some sort of value associated with it. That's the kind of thing you want to use gamification for. But that said, I think that you have to look at gamification as not necessarily a way to, get students excited about, just about, oh, okay, this thing I don't normally like is now closer to the thing I like. But rather, how can we actually use this to encourage different learning styles and also incentivize students? Games offer that immediate feedback, right? So if I do this quest, I get this reward. That reward helps me get stronger so I can go do this other thing, right? And that's why the things like Wii Fit and that kind of stuff were so successful, why the Apple Watch is so successful, because it gives you that feedback, right? It gives you that material thing saying, you have done this much, and this is the reward or the value that you are getting out of it. And I think that you have to look at gamification as providing that. So one of the things that, even though I've done some gamification work, is that I'm very hesitant to say, this is the way forward, this is how you reach Gen Z and that kind of thing, because I think in a way it is kind of pandering, right? It's just like, putting out assignments on Twitter and Instagram and stuff like that. After a certain point, you're just, essentially saying, I don't want students to go outside of the thing they've already created. I'm just going to try to meet them where they are, but you're not really of that world, right? That there is something to kind of be said for the fact that you as an instructor or a professor, you do have that kind of layer of abstraction between yourself and your experiences and the students' experiences, right? And so simply saying, hey, I like video games, I like board games too, let's bring those in, let's make class a game. You do absolutely run that risk, right? The inclination is you're going to start doing things like, oh, assignments are quests and points are XP and all that, is that you start getting really cutesy with it. Oh, where there are kingdoms and there are quests in the kingdoms. You can write this elaborate fiction about all this kind of stuff. You don't have to do that. And honestly, this is where that pandering part comes in. Unless you've kind of already set up the expectation with your students that, hey, the professor's kind of a goofball. This is what I'm just doing this to amuse myself more than anything. Students will look at it and be like, I can't really take this seriously. I just wouldn't get too cute with it. I would just use the basic principles of feedback, rewards, flexibility, etc. Give students multiple paths to solve a problem, right? In the best games, that's what they do, right? Here's the thing you have to do. You're a goose, you have to steal this guy's keys. Now, there's a couple different ways you can do that. There's one way the developers thought of, but there might be another way to do it. And so, in my mind, a really well-developed game design course, gamification course, would actually give students the ability to say, hey, here's my objective. I want to pass the class, right? and now I can do that any number of different ways. Now, in the reality, as a professor, you still have the ability to kind of constrict what that means, just like a game designer, but it gives students the flexibility and freedom to kind of say, I'm better at this, or this speaks to my strengths, or I want to challenge myself in this way, and that would then give them the ability to do that. So first off, I would highly recommend, if you're an instructor who wants to gamify a course, I would start off by really looking at what other folks have done. There are all kinds of resources out there. There's badging systems, there's Classcraft, there's that kind of thing, and you can use these to develop it. But I would also encourage you to take a look not just at the gamification literature, but start looking into some of the game design literature. In fact, a lot of the things we're trying to do in these classes, game designers have already figured out, right? And if you're going to design the class around this, if you're teaching someone to play a game or teaching the rules of a game, you are teaching them, right? You are trying to educate them about what this game is asking of them and what they are expected to do. And you can find a lot of literature that really does apply very, very well to the actual classroom. So that's the other thing, is that gamification, if you're going to gamify something, it can't just be, okay, here's another assignment you have to do for a grade. It has to be kind of more philosophical and baked into the course, that you're giving students the ability to kind of pursue this at their own pace and just do different challenges, and even in some ways maybe play to the strengths they have, right? Those are other things you can kind of play with that also kind of implement that sort of personal growth mindset into them, right? So this isn't really your area or something that you consider yourself innately good at, but there's a little perk for trying to go outside of your comfort zone. That's the kind of stuff you can do with gamification. You just have to be really, really clear and upfront about how you're doing it.